December wind howled through the Texas plains like a ghost seeking redemption. Thomas Mackenzie sat in his weathered leather chair, 85 years carved deep into his face, watching the flames dance in the stone fireplace he'd built with his own hands 33 years ago. The Winchester Model 1873 leaned against the mantel, its iron frame catching firelight like old memories catching flame. Jimmy Mackenzie shifted uncomfortably on the wooden stool, 20 years old and restless as a caged Mustang. His great-uncle's eyes held that distant look again, the one that meant stories were coming, whether Jimmy wanted to hear them or not. "You're fixing to ship out come spring," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "War's calling you like it called your daddy before you. Like it called me when I was fool enough to think I knew what fighting meant." Jimmy nodded, unsure where this was heading. Outside, cattle lowed in the distance. 2,000 head of prime beef that made Iron Cross Ranch the largest operation in 3 counties. Hard to believe it started with one man, one rifle, and a decision that changed everything. "Before you go carrying that Mackenzie name into battle, you need to know how it got its weight," Thomas continued. "Your daddy Billy was 12 years old when I learned what real courage looks like. Wasn't my courage, mind you. Belonged to a woman who taught this old cowboy that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is save a life instead of taking one." The old man reached for a small wooden box on the side table, his fingers still steady despite his age. Inside lay a simple silver cross, no bigger than a man's thumb, worn smooth by countless prayers. This belonged to Sister Mary Catherine Walsh, Irish girl, 26 years old, with eyes blue as a Texas summer sky and hands that could heal what bullets tore apart. She came to our town in 1883, carrying nothing but a medical bag and faith strong enough to shame the devil himself. Thomas held the cross up to the firelight, and Jimmy saw something flicker across the old man's face, soft as candlelight but warm as desert sun. "She also nearly got herself hanged for witchcraft before I knew what hit me." Salvation Creek, Texas, September 15th, 1883. The cottonwood tree stood like a gallows against the cloudless sky, its twisted branches reaching toward heaven, while its roots drank deep from ground soaked with injustice. Sister Catherine hung there at 2 o'clock sharp, when the Texas sun burned hottest and mercy seemed nothing but a word decent folks forgot when fear took hold. Manila hemp rope, 3/4 inch thick, bit into her wrists where they stretched high above her head. Her black habit torn at the hem, dust coating the sacred cloth like shame on Sunday morning. The men who'd strung her up rode away laughing, calling her witch and devil lover, their voices fading into the prairie wind that carried nothing but the creak of rope and the whisper of dying grass. She'd been in Salvation Creek exactly 47 days when they came for her. 47 days of treating sick children with herbs and prayers, of sitting vigil beside fever beds, of asking nothing but water for her horse and a place to rest her medical bag. The Archbishop in Boston had sent her west with specific instructions: establish a medical mission among the poor, bring God's healing to the frontier, and trust in divine providence to protect her work. Divine providence, it seemed, had other plans. The crowd that gathered to watch her die numbered close to 60 souls, though precious few looked comfortable with the entertainment. Judge Samuel Morrison stood at the front, his black coat buttoned tight despite the heat, silver watch chain catching sunlight like a snake's scales. At 58, Morrison controlled every legal decision in 3 counties, and his interpretation of frontier justice left little room for mercy when it came to Catholics and foreigners. "Let this be a lesson to any who would bring popish superstition to God-fearing country," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This woman corrupted our children with her devil's medicine, turned good Christian families against their own faith. The wages of witchcraft is death, and death she shall have." A few voices murmured agreement, but most folks just stared at the ground or found sudden interest in adjusting their hat brims. Mrs. Martha Henley, the banker's wife, kept dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Doc Harrison shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking like a man who'd eaten something that disagreed with him. Even Deputy Wade Thompson seemed more interested in watching the horizon than the woman slowly dying before his eyes. Sister Catherine tried to speak, to explain one more time that she'd done nothing but heal the sick and comfort the dying. But the rope had been tied with professional precision, tight enough to cut off most of her air without quite killing her outright. Her voice came out as little more than a whisper, lost in the endless Texas wind. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats, slow and steady, not the wild gallop of men riding to join the entertainment. A measured four-count rhythm that spoke of purpose rather than passion, of a man who'd seen enough death to know its weight. Thomas Mackenzie appeared on the rise like judgment itself, sitting tall in the saddle of a bay gelding that had carried him through Indian wars and cattle drives, through drought and flood, and every kind of hell the frontier could devise. His Winchester rested easy across his saddle, 44-40 caliber, and accurate to 300 yards in the right hands. At 52, Thomas had the right hands for most anything that needed doing. His ranch spread across 2,400 acres of prime grazing land just north of Salvation Creek, home to 800 head of Texas Longhorn cattle and a dozen quarter horses that could work cattle like they were born to it. The Iron Cross brand marked his stock, a simple cross inside a circle that every cattleman in 3 counties recognized and respected. Thomas Mackenzie paid his debts, honored his word, and asked nothing from any man but the right to work his land in peace. He'd been coming back from checking his north pasture when he heard the commotion. Rode up expecting to find a horse thief getting frontier justice or maybe someone settling a gambling debt the hard way. What he found instead was a woman in nun's clothing, slowly strangling, while good Christian people watched and did nothing. Thomas reined in his horse directly beneath the cottonwood tree, his gray eyes taking in every detail with the cold precision of a man who'd learned to read death signs on faces and landscapes alike. The woman's lips were turning blue, her body trembling with the effort to draw breath. She couldn't have more than 10 minutes before the rope finished what the heat and exhaustion had started. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of a nickel-plated Colt revolver that had probably never been fired outside a gunsmith's shop. "Move along, Mackenzie," Morrison called out. "This doesn't concern you or your cattle operation." Thomas didn't move. Instead, he studied Sister Catherine's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes even as consciousness flickered like a dying candle. He'd seen that same look on his wife Margaret's face when the fever took her 6 years ago. That mixture of fear and determination that marked someone too stubborn to quit, even when quitting made perfect sense. "Seems to me," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard, "you're fixing to hang someone who never had a proper trial." "She had her trial," Morrison shot back, "caught red-handed practicing witchcraft on the Gonzalez boy. Saved him from fever with devil's medicine when Doc Harrison himself said the child was beyond help." Thomas almost laughed. Almost. Miguel Gonzalez was his neighbor to the south, a hard-working Mexican rancher with 5 kids and a wife who made the best tortillas this side of San Antonio. If someone saved that man's boy from fever, they deserved a medal, not a rope. "What kind of witchcraft?" Thomas asked, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd been climbing on and off horses since he could walk. "Herbs and incantations," Morrison replied. "Unnatural healing that mocks God's will." Thomas stepped closer to the judge, close enough to smell the pomade in the man's carefully groomed hair and see the sweat stains under his expensive coat arms. At 6 feet 2 inches and 200 pounds of muscle hardened by 30 years of ranch work, Thomas Mackenzie cast a shadow that made smaller men nervous. "Miguel Gonzalez told me his boy was dying of pneumonia," Thomas said quietly. "Said this woman brought him willow bark tea and sat up 3 nights straight keeping cool rags on his fever. That sound like witchcraft to you?" "She prayed over him in Latin," Morrison insisted. "Spoke words no Christian woman should know." "Latin," Thomas repeated. "You mean like what Father Santos uses during Mass every Sunday?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Most folks in Salvation Creek attended the small Catholic mission on the east side of town, where Father Miguel Santos said Mass in Latin every week for the Mexican families and any Anglos brave enough to ignore Morrison's disapproval. Sister Catherine's breathing grew more labored. Thomas could see the rope cutting deeper into her wrists where the weight of her body pulled against the bonds. Time was running short. "I'm cutting her down," Thomas announced, reaching for the knife on his belt. Morrison's hand dropped to his gun butt. "You interfere with legal justice, Mackenzie, and you'll answer for it in court." Thomas paused, his fingers touching the bone handle of his skinning knife. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, honed to perfection for field dressing deer and cutting rope when necessary. But Morrison wasn't wrong about the legal complications. Even in frontier Texas, interfering with a court-ordered execution could bring serious consequences. That's when Sister Catherine found her voice. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying enough desperation to stop every conversation within 50 yards. "I just wanted to help." Thomas looked up at Sister Catherine's face, seeing something there that reminded him powerfully of his late wife Margaret. Not the physical features, though both women shared that particular shade of blue eyes that seemed to hold depths a man could lose himself in. No, what struck Thomas was the expression of absolute determination even in the face of certain death. Margaret had looked at him the same way when the fever took her, right before she made him promise to take care of Billy if anything happened to his brother Robert. Robert Mackenzie had died 3 years later in the Indian Wars, leaving his 12-year-old son orphaned and Thomas honor-bound to raise the boy as his own. Billy was the reason Thomas recognized Sister Catherine at all. The boy had nearly died of pneumonia the previous winter, and when Doc Harrison gave up hope, someone told Thomas about a Catholic woman who knew herbs and healing. He'd ridden through a blizzard to bring her back to the ranch, and she'd sat up 4 nights straight nursing Billy back to health. When Thomas tried to pay her, she'd refused every cent and asked only that he donate something to the church poor box when he had the chance. Now that same woman hung dying, while good Christian people watched like it was a Sunday entertainment. "Judge Morrison," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the crowd like the crack of a bullwhip, "I'm invoking Section 12 of the Territorial Code regarding interference with lawful execution." Morrison blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What's Section 12? "The one that gives any property owner the right to challenge execution on his land," Thomas replied smoothly, though no such section existed. "This cottonwood tree sits on the boundary line between your town property and my north pasture. I'm claiming jurisdiction." It was pure bluff, but delivered with such calm authority that half the crowd started nodding like they remembered reading about Section 12 themselves. Morrison's face reddened, but he couldn't call Thomas a liar without admitting he didn't know the territorial code as well as he claimed. "That's ridiculous," Morrison sputtered. "This tree has been town property for 15 years. "Then you won't mind riding back to town and getting the survey documents," Thomas replied. "Soon as you prove legal ownership, you can finish your hanging. Until then, I'm cutting her down." Thomas stepped forward and reached up with his knife, the blade flashing silver in the afternoon sun. The rope parted with a sharp snap, and Sister Catherine dropped like a stone into his waiting arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling with exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Thomas could feel her heart racing against his chest like a trapped bird, and when she looked up at him with those blue eyes, he saw gratitude deeper than any words could express. "Easy now," he murmured, steadying her on her feet. "You're safe." Judge Morrison's hand tightened on his gun, but before he could draw, another voice cut through the tension. "I think that's quite enough excitement for one afternoon." Father Miguel Santos rode into the clearing on a spotted mare, his black cassock dusty from hard riding. At 40 years old, the priest carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd seen both the best and worst of human nature, and somehow managed to keep faith in both. More importantly, he carried a Colt revolver on his hip, and everyone knew he'd used it more than once to protect his parishioners from raiders and rustlers. "Sister Catherine," Father Santos said, dismounting with practiced ease, "the bishop sent word that you were coming. We've been expecting you at the mission." Morrison's jaw worked like he was chewing leather. "This woman is under arrest for practicing witchcraft." "This woman," Father Santos replied calmly, "is a sister of mercy with 6 years of medical training from the finest doctors in Boston. She carries a letter of introduction from Archbishop Williams himself. Would you like me to send word to Washington that you've been hanging Catholic missionaries?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Everyone knew the territorial government was trying to bring more settlers west, and reports of religious persecution would bring unwanted attention from federal authorities. Morrison holstered his gun, but his eyes promised this wasn't over. "She'll answer for corrupting good Christian families with her popish superstitions. Then she'll answer in a proper court with proper representation," Father Santos replied. "Not at the end of a lynch rope." The crowd began to disperse, most folks looking relieved to escape before the situation turned any uglier. Morrison mounted his horse but paused long enough to fix Thomas with a stare that could freeze water in July. "This isn't finished, Mackenzie. You'll regret interfering with justice." Thomas met the judge's gaze without flinching. "Wouldn't be the first time I've regretted doing the right thing." The ride back to Iron Cross Ranch took 40 minutes through rolling prairie that stretched toward the horizon like a green sea. Sister Catherine rode behind Thomas on his bay gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, her head resting against his broad back. She'd barely spoken since the rescue. Whether from exhaustion or shock, Thomas couldn't say. The ranch house sat in a natural depression near Willow Creek, surrounded by cottonwoods and live oaks that provided blessed shade during the brutal summer months. Thomas had built it himself after Margaret died, needing something to do with his hands while his heart learned to beat without her. 2 stories of solid timber and native stone, with a wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze and windows positioned to provide clear fields of fire in all directions. A man learned to think defensively after losing everything once. Billy Mackenzie stood on the porch as they rode up, all 12 years and 90 pounds of him trying to look like the man of the house. The boy had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, along with a stubborn streak of white as the Rio Grande. When he saw Sister Catherine, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "Sister Cat," Billy called out, using the nickname he'd given her during his illness. "Uncle Tom said you might be in trouble." Thomas helped Sister Catherine down from the horse, noting how she steadied herself against the saddle for a moment before finding her balance. The rope burns on her wrists had swollen angry and red, and her breathing still came shorter than it should. "Billy," Thomas said quietly, "run inside and fix some coffee. The real stuff, not that chicory nonsense." The boy nodded and disappeared into the house, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. Thomas led Sister Catherine to one of the rocking chairs on the porch, noting how carefully she moved, like every muscle in her body had been pulled tight and might snap if stressed too far. "You didn't have to risk yourself for me," she said, her voice still hoarse from the rope. "That man Morrison, he's dangerous." "I've dealt with dangerous men before," Thomas replied, settling into the chair beside her. "Question is, what did you do to get his attention?" Sister Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her blue eyes fixed on the cattle grazing in the distance. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much suffering and couldn't quite figure out how to stop trying to heal it. "I saved a child's life," she said simply. "Miguel Gonzalez brought his son to me 3 weeks ago. The boy was burning with fever, couldn't keep food down, barely conscious. Doc Harrison said there was nothing to be done except pray and prepare for burial." Thomas nodded, remembering his own desperate ride through the blizzard when Billy lay dying. "What did you do?" "What I was trained to do," Sister Catherine replied. "Willow bark for the fever, chamomile tea for his stomach, cool compresses to bring his temperature down. I sat with him for 3 days, monitoring his breathing, adjusting his position to help his lungs clear. Basic medical care, nothing more." "But he lived." "He lived," she confirmed, completely recovered within a week. Started gaining weight, playing with his brothers, acting like a normal, healthy boy. His parents were so grateful they spread word throughout the Mexican community that there was a healer at the mission. Thomas began to understand the problem, and word spread to the Anglo families. "Mrs. Patterson brought her daughter for treatment of consumption. Mr. Henley asked me to look at his horse's infected leg. Before I knew it, I was treating half the town for everything from broken bones to difficult births." Sister Catherine's voice grew bitter. "Apparently saving lives is acceptable when it's your own people. When it's a Catholic woman using herbs and prayers, it becomes witchcraft." Billy emerged from the house carrying a tray with 3 cups of steaming coffee and a plate of biscuits left over from breakfast. The boy had inherited his grandmother's gift for hospitality along with her green eyes. "Sister Cat," Billy said, setting the tray on the small table between the rockers, "are you going to stay here now? Uncle Tom's got plenty of room and I could show you how to rope cattle and everything." Thomas saw something flicker across Sister Catherine's face, a mixture of longing and pain that spoke of choices no person should have to make. She reached out and tousled Billy's dark hair with gentle fingers. "I don't know what's going to happen, young man, but I appreciate the invitation." "Judge Morrison's not going to let this rest," Thomas said, accepting a cup of coffee and inhaling the rich aroma. Real coffee was a luxury on the frontier, But a man needed some comforts when the world seemed determined to grind him down. He's got political ambitions, and backing down from a Catholic woman won't sit well with his supporters. What kind of political ambitions? Sister Catherine asked. Territorial governor, eventually. Maybe even statehood senator if Texas ever gets admitted to the Union. Thomas sipped his coffee and watched the sun begin its slow slide toward the western horizon. Morrison's been buying up land all through this county, claiming it's for development and progress. Truth is, the Texas and Pacific Railroad wants to run a line through here, and anyone who controls the land controls the profits. Billy perked up with the enthusiasm of youth discovering adult secrets. Is that why he's been trying to buy our ranch? Thomas shot the boy a sharp look. Who told you that? I heard you and Ben Hawkins talking last month. Sheriff Hawkins said Morrison offered to buy Iron Cross for twice what it's worth, but you told him to go to hell. Language, Billy. Sorry, Uncle Tom, you told him to go to heck. Sister Catherine hid a smile behind her coffee cup. If he wants your land that badly, wouldn't it be easier to simply make you an offer you couldn't refuse? Hard to refuse a man when he's got no legal grounds to force a sale, Thomas replied. But if he could prove I was harboring a dangerous criminal or that my ranch had become a center for illegal activity, he might be able to convince a territorial judge to seize the property under eminent domain. The implications hung in the evening air like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Sister Catherine set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, and Thomas realized the full magnitude of the trap Morrison was setting. He's using me to get to you, she said quietly. Looks that way. Then I should leave, tonight. I won't be responsible for you losing everything because you tried to help me. Billy jumped up from where he'd been sitting on the porch steps. No, Sister Cat, you can't leave. Uncle Tom won't let anything bad happen to you. He's the toughest man in Texas. Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the absolute faith in the boy's voice. Billy had already lost his parents, and now he was facing the possibility of losing the woman who'd saved his life and the man who'd become his father. At 12 years old, Billy Mackenzie had endured more loss than most adults could handle. Nobody's leaving anywhere tonight, Thomas said firmly. Morrison may be a snake, but he's not stupid enough to move against us without getting his legal ground solid first. That gives us time to figure out our next move. Sister Catherine looked at him with those blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. Why are you doing this? You barely know me, and defending me could cost you everything you've built here. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the western sky while night sounds began to rise from the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and cattle lowed softly as they settled for the evening. These were the sounds of home, of a life built through hard work and sacrifice. 6 years ago, he said finally, my wife Margaret lay dying of fever, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Sat beside her bed for 4 days, watching her burn up from the inside while I prayed to a God who didn't seem to be listening. She died holding my hand, begging me to take care of Billy if anything happened to Robert. Thomas paused, feeling the familiar ache that came with Margaret's memory. Last winter, when Billy was dying of pneumonia, I watched you sit beside his bed for 4 nights straight, doing everything I couldn't do for my wife. You saved that boy's life with nothing but herbs and determination and a faith that seemed to move mountains. He turned to meet Sister Catherine's gaze directly. Maybe God wasn't listening when Margaret needed healing, but maybe he was listening when you prayed over Billy. Either way, I figure I owe you the same chance you gave my nephew. Billy had gone quiet, sensing the weight of the conversation even if he didn't fully understand it. Sister Catherine reached out and took Thomas's weathered hand in both of hers, her touch warm and steady despite everything she'd endured that day. Thank you, she said simply, but the words carried depths of meaning that needed no elaboration. That night, as Sister Catherine settled into the guest bedroom that had stood empty since Margaret died, and Billy slept peacefully in his own bed for the first time in weeks, Thomas stood on his porch looking out at the vast Texas sky. Somewhere out there, Judge Morrison was probably planning his next move, and the territorial authorities were deciding how to handle reports of religious persecution on the frontier. Thomas checked the loads in his Winchester and settled into his rocking chair for a long night of watching and waiting. Whatever came next, Iron Cross Ranch would be ready. The stakes had been set, the players revealed, and the game begun. In the morning, they would learn what kind of hand Judge Morrison intended to play, and whether a stubborn rancher, a determined nun, and a 12-year-old boy could stand against the forces gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, Thomas Mackenzie sat guard over the two people who had become his family and counted that as victory enough. Dawn broke over Iron Cross Ranch with the promise of trouble riding in on the morning wind. Thomas stood on his porch, Winchester cradled in his arms, watching the sun paint the eastern sky the color of blood. He'd been awake since 3, listening to the night sounds that told a man who knew how to hear them whether danger was approaching or holding its distance. Sister Catherine emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early rising. She'd traded her torn black habit for one of Margaret's old dresses, a simple brown cotton that fit her slight frame better than Thomas cared to notice. Her dark hair, freed from the confines of her wimple, caught the morning light and made her look younger than her 26 years. "Any sign of visitors?" she asked, handing him one of the cups. "Not yet, but they'll come." Thomas sipped the coffee, noting she'd made it strong enough to wake the dead. "Question is whether they'll come with warrants or with rope." Billy emerged from the barn leading Thomas's favorite quarter horse, a buckskin gelding named Sergeant, who could cut cattle like he was reading their minds. The boy had been up even earlier, tending to the morning chores with the dedication of someone who understood that ranch work didn't wait for anyone's convenience. "Sergeant's ready if you need to ride out," Billy called. Fed and watered, checked his hooves for stones. "He's moving sound." Thomas nodded approvingly. The boy was learning responsibility faster than most men twice his age, driven by the kind of necessity that turned children into adults before their time. In 6 months, Billy had progressed from barely knowing which end of a horse to bite to handling the morning routine with practiced competence. "Come here, son," Thomas said. "Time you learn some things you're going to need." Billy jogged over with the eager energy of youth, his green eyes bright with curiosity. Sister Catherine settled into the other rocking chair, sensing that something important was about to happen. "First lesson," Thomas began, pulling a leather-bound ledger from beside his chair. "Every successful ranch runs on numbers, and numbers don't lie. We've got 800 head of cattle, 50 horses, and enough land to support twice that if we manage it right. But land and livestock are only as valuable as your ability to protect them." Thomas opened the ledger, revealing pages covered with neat handwriting that documented every aspect of Iron Cross Ranch operations. Cattle births and deaths, feed costs, market prices, weather patterns, water table levels, predator losses, and a dozen other factors that determined the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy. "Billy, what did we lose to coyotes last month?" The boy frowned, concentrating. 6 calves and 2 yearlings cost us maybe $60 at current market prices. "Good. And what's our best defense against predator losses?" "Night patrols," Billy answered promptly. 2 riders, different routes each night, armed and ready. "Right again." "Sister Catherine, what's the most dangerous threat to cattle health in this climate?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she might bring to diagnosing a fever. "Based on what I've observed, I'd say contaminated water sources. Bacteria and parasites thrive in standing water, especially during hot weather." Thomas smiled, pleased by her quick understanding. "Exactly. Most ranchers lose more stock to disease than predators, but they spend all their time worrying about wolves and rustlers." He turned to a fresh page in the ledger, one marked with today's date. "Now here's what you both need to understand about our current situation. Judge Morrison wants this land for the railroad, and he's willing to use any legal excuse to get it. That makes us targets, and targets need to think like soldiers." Billy straightened up, his young face suddenly serious. "What kind of soldiers?" "The kind that win by being smarter than the enemy, not just tougher." Thomas pointed to a rough map he'd sketched in the margin of the page. "Iron Cross Ranch sits on 2,400 acres, but not all acres are equal. Our south pasture borders Willow Creek, which gives us year-round water access. Our north pasture has the best grass, perfect for fattening cattle before market. And our east boundary is exactly where the railroad wants to run their main line." Sister Catherine studied the map with growing understanding. He doesn't just want your ranch, he wants to control the entire route. Smart woman, Morrison's been buying up land parcels for 2 years, always through intermediaries, always for prices that seem too good to be true. Families take his money and move on, never realizing they're selling to the same man who's been pressuring them to leave. Thomas closed the ledger and looked directly at both of them. That's why harboring a dangerous criminal gives him the perfect excuse to seize our property. He can claim we're a threat to community safety, get a federal marshal to condemn the ranch, and force a sale at government at auction where he'll be the only serious bidder. Billy's jaw set with determination that reminded Thomas powerfully of his brother Robert. So what do? We get smarter than he is, Thomas replied. First rule of fighting a bigger enemy, don't fight on his terms. Morrison wants us to react like angry ranchers, to make mistakes he can use against us in court. Instead, we're going to think like chess players. Thomas rose from his chair and walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. Billy, I want you to ride to the Gonzalez place this morning. Ask Miguel if he's had any visits from Morrison's people lately. Find out if anyone's been asking questions about Sister Catherine or making offers to buy Mexican land. Yes, sir. What should I tell him about Sister Cat? Tell him she's under our protection and that any family needing medical attention is welcome to visit the ranch. Make sure he understands we're not hiding anything. Sister Catherine looked up sharply. Thomas, that could be dangerous. If people start coming here for treatment, it gives Morrison more ammunition for his witchcraft accusations. Maybe, Thomas agreed. Or maybe it gives us witnesses who can testify about your real medical training when this goes to court. Half the Mexican families in this county owe you their children's lives. Morrison's going to have a hard time convincing a jury that saving babies is devil's work. He turned to Sister Catherine with an expression that mixed respect with something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to name. Second lesson for both of you. Sometimes the best defense is making yourself too valuable to destroy. By noon, Iron Cross Ranch had received its first visitors, though not the ones Thomas had been expecting. Miguel Gonzalez arrived with his wife Maria and their 5 children, the youngest still weak from the fever that had nearly killed him 3 weeks earlier. Behind them came 2 more families, the Herreras and the Salazars, all carrying bundles that suggested they planned to stay for more than a social visit. Senor Mackenzie, ago, Miguel called out as he dismounted from his horse. We bring news and we bring help. Thomas stepped off the porch to greet them, noting the way Miguel's hand rested on the butt of an old Navy Colt that had seen better days but probably still shot straight. These weren't social visitors. They were men ready for trouble. What kind of news, Miguel? Morrison's men came to our places yesterday evening, Maria Gonzalez said, her voice tight with worry, offering to buy our land for half what it's worth, saying it would be safer for Mexican families to move closer to the border. Safer from what? Sister Catherine asked, emerging from the house with Billy close behind. From angry Anglos who don't appreciate foreign influence, Miguel replied bitterly. Seems there's been talk in town about Catholic conspiracies and Mexican witchcraft corrupting good Christian families. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest like bile, hot and bitter. Morrison wasn't just targeting individuals anymore. He was trying to drive out entire communities that might support Sister Catherine's medical work. It was strategic, calculating, and utterly without conscience. How many families got visits? Thomas asked. All of them, said Carlos Herrera, a weathered man in his 50s who ran cattle on a smaller spread 10 miles south. Every Mexican landowner between here and the creek. Morrison's offering quick cash and safe passage to families willing to sell immediately. And threatening what if they don't sell? Carlos exchanged glances with Miguel before answering. Nothing specific, but his deputies have been asking questions about property taxes, water rights, legal documentation, looking for reasons to cause trouble if people don't take his generous offer. Sister Catherine stepped forward, her blue eyes blazing with righteous anger. These families have been here for generations. They have as much right to this land as anyone. Right doesn't matter if you can't prove it in court, Thomas replied grimly. Most Mexican land grants date back to when this was still Mexico. Proving ownership means having original documents that half these families lost in the war, plus legal representation they can't afford. Billy had been listening with the intense concentration of someone learning that the adult world was far more complicated and dangerous than he'd imagined. Uncle Tom, can't we help them prove their ownership? Thomas looked at the boy with something approaching pride. Smart question. What do you think we could do? Billy considered the problem with the same methodical approach Thomas had been teaching him to use for ranch management. Well, they've been paying property taxes, right? And they've got bills of sale for livestock, receipts for supplies, maybe letters from banks about loans. That's all documentation of legal ownership. Excellent thinking, Sister Catherine said warmly. In Boston, I helped immigrant families navigate legal documentation issues. Most people don't realize that establishing residency and legitimate business activity is often more important than having original land grants. Thomas felt a surge of respect for both of them. Billy was learning to think like a strategist, while Sister Catherine was revealing depths of practical knowledge that went far beyond medical training. All right, Thomas said, here's what we're going to do. Miguel, can you gather all the Mexican families tomorrow evening? Bring every piece of paper you've got, tax receipts, bills of sale, correspondence, anything with official stamps or signatures. See, but what good will papers do if Morrison controls the court? Maybe none, Thomas admitted. But Sister Catherine's right about documentation. If we can prove that Mexican families have been legitimate residents and taxpayers, it makes Morrison's harassment look like what it really is. Racial persecution designed to steal land. Maria Gonzalez stepped forward, her dark eyes fixed on Sister Catherine with the intensity of a mother protecting her children. Senora, there is something else. Something you need to know about the danger you face. Thomas felt his gut tighten. What kind of danger? Morrison has been meeting with men from Austin, Maria said quietly. Government men, talking about federal investigations into Catholic activities on the frontier. They're saying the church might be using medical missions to gather information for foreign governments. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Morrison could convince federal authorities that Sister Catherine was some kind of spy, using her medical work as cover for intelligence gathering, it would transform her from a local legal problem into a national security threat. That's insane, Billy said hotly. Sister Cat's not a spy. She's a nun. Doesn't matter what she really is, Thomas replied grimly. Matters what Morrison can make a federal judge believe she is. Sister Catherine had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. The Sisters of Mercy work throughout the territories, establishing missions and medical facilities. If they can discredit our work here, it could affect every Catholic medical mission from Texas to California. Thomas began to understand the true scope of Morrison's ambition. This wasn't just about railroad land or local political power. The judge was positioning himself as a defender against foreign Catholic influence in the territories, a role that could catapult him to territorial governor or even federal office. We need allies, Thomas said finally. Mexican families won't be enough if this goes federal. We need Anglo support, preferably from people with political connections. Sheriff Hawkins? Billy suggested hopefully. Thomas shook his head. Ben's a good man, but he's got a wife and kids to think about. Can't ask him to risk his family for our fight. What about Dr. Harrison? Sister Catherine asked. He's seen my medical work firsthand. He knows I'm not practicing witchcraft. Doc's too afraid of losing his practice, Miguel said bluntly. Morrison controls the medical licensing in 3 counties. Cross him, and Doc Harrison could find himself unable to legally treat patients. They stood in the afternoon heat, each lost in thought, searching for allies in a situation that seemed to offer nothing but enemies. That's when Thomas heard hoofbeats approaching from the east, steady and purposeful. Rider coming, he announced, his hand moving instinctively to his Winchester. The horse and rider crested the small rise near the creek, and Thomas felt relief wash over him like cool water. Ben Hawkins sat easy in the saddle, wearing his sheriff's badge and an expression that mixed determination with deep reluctance. Ben, Thomas called out as his old friend dismounted. Didn't expect to see you today. Sheriff Hawkins was a man in his mid-40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of steady demeanor that made nervous people feel safer and guilty people feel watched. He'd ridden with Thomas during the Apache troubles 5 years back, and they'd saved each other's lives often enough to build the kind of trust that went deeper than words. Thomas, Ben said quietly. We need to talk. Sheriff Ben Hawkins accepted a cup of coffee and settled onto the porch steps, his hat in his hands and worry lines carved deep around his eyes. The Mexican families had withdrawn to give them privacy, but Thomas could feel their attention like heat from a forge. I've got two pieces of news, Ben said without preamble. One's bad, the other's worse. Give me the bad first, Thomas replied. Morrison's filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office. Claims you're harboring a fugitive wanted for practicing medicine without a license, corrupting public morals, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. Sister Catherine drew in a sharp breath. Conspiracy to defraud? Apparently you've been treating patients without paying the territorial medical tax, Ben explained. Every licensed medical practitioner has to pay $50 annually to the Territorial Medical Board. Since you're not licensed and haven't paid the tax, any fees you have collected constitute fraud. Thomas laughed bitterly. She's never charged a penny for her services. Doesn't matter. Morrison's got 3 witnesses who'll swear they paid her for medical treatment, including Mrs. Patterson, who'll testify that Sister Catherine charged her $5 for treating her daughter's consumption. That's a lie, Sister Catherine said flatly. Mrs. Patterson offered to pay me, and I refused. She insisted on donating food to the mission instead. Your word against hers, Ben replied. And unfortunately, Mrs. Patterson's word carries weight with the territorial authorities. Thomas felt the trap closing around them with mechanical precision. Morrison had been planning this for weeks, perhaps months, building a legal case that would stand up in territorial court regardless of the truth. What's the worst news? Thomas asked. Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man being forced to choose between friendship and duty. Federal marshals are coming, day after tomorrow, with a warrant for Sister Catherine's arrest. They'll also have seizure orders for any property used in the commission of federal crimes. The words hung in the afternoon air like gun smoke. Thomas felt Billy move closer to him, the boy's young face tight with fear and confusion. Ben, Thomas said carefully, you're not just here as a friend, are you? Sheriff Hawkins looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze with eyes that held years of shared dangers and mutual respect. I'm here to officially inform you that harboring a federal fugitive is a crime punishable by loss of property and up to 5 years in territorial prison. I'm also here to suggest that Sister Catherine might want to consider turning herself in voluntarily to avoid any unnecessary complications. What kind of complications? Sister Catherine asked. Ben's jaw tightened. The kind that happen when federal marshals have to track down fugitives on private property. Things get broken, people get hurt, questions get asked later. Thomas understood the subtext. Morrison had arranged for federal marshals who wouldn't be particularly careful about property damage or civilian safety. If they had to storm Iron Cross Ranch to arrest Sister Catherine, the resulting chaos would provide perfect justification for seizing the property as evidence of criminal activity. How long do we have? Thomas asked. Marshals left Austin this morning. Riding hard, changing horses at way stations. Figure they'll reach Salvation Creek sometime tomorrow evening, make their arrests Thursday morning. Less than 36 hours. Not much time to prepare for a siege or organize an escape. Sister Catherine stood up abruptly, her decision written clearly on her face. I'll go with you now, Sheriff Hawkins. There's no reason for Thomas and Billy to suffer for my problems. Like hell you will, Thomas said sharply. Thomas, be reasonable. They're offering me a chance to surrender peacefully. If I go voluntarily, maybe they'll be satisfied with arresting me and leave your ranch alone. You think Morrison's going to stop with the arresting you? Thomas's voice carried the edge of a man who'd seen too much of human nature to believe in mercy from enemies. Soon as you're in custody, he'll claim you confessed to using this ranch as a base for illegal operations. 2 days later, federal marshals will be back with seizure orders. Ben nodded reluctantly. Thomas is right. Morrison's not planning to stop with one arrest. He wants this land, and he's got federal backing to take it. Billy had been listening with the intensity of someone learning that the world was far more dangerous and complicated than he'd ever imagined. Sheriff Hawkins, what if we could prove Sister Catherine's innocent? Would that stop the federal marshals? Ben looked at the boy with something approaching pity. Son, innocence is something you prove in court, after you have been arrested and charged. These marshals aren't coming to investigate. They're coming to arrest someone they've already decided is guilty. Sister Catherine sat back down heavily, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her like stones. Then what do you suggest? I can't run forever, and I won't let Thomas lose everything because he tried to help me. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking with the strategic mind that had kept him alive through Indian wars and range disputes. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd found his course and intended to follow it regardless of consequences. We don't run, and we don't surrender, he said. We fight. Thomas, Ben said urgently, you can't fight federal marshals. That's not a range dispute or a boundary argument. That's treason. Not if we're defending against an illegal seizure based on false charges, Thomas replied. Sister Catherine's committed no federal crimes, and Morrison knows it. He's using federal authority to steal private property, and that makes him the criminal. Ben stood up, settling his hat on his head with the resignation of a man who'd failed to prevent a disaster but had tried his best. I can't be part of this, Thomas. I've got a wife and children to think about. I know, Ben. I'm not asking you to choose sides, just asking you to remember that some things are worth fighting for. Sheriff Hawkins mounted his horse but paused before riding away. Martha wanted me to tell Sister Catherine that our daughter's been asking about her every day since she cured her croup. Girl keeps asking when the nice lady doctor is coming back to check on her. With that, he rode away, leaving Thomas and Sister Catherine to contemplate a future that offered no easy choices and no safe outcomes. That evening, Iron Cross Ranch buzzed with activity like a hive preparing for winter. The Mexican families had sent riders to spread word throughout their community, and by sunset, 23 adults and 16 children had gathered in Thomas's main pasture. They came armed with rifles and pistols, determination and fear mixing in equal measure on their weathered faces. Thomas stood before them in the gathering dusk, feeling the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. These people were trusting him with their lives and their futures, betting everything on his ability to outfight and outthink forces that held every legal and political advantage. I won't lie to you, Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly across the group. What we're planning is dangerous, probably illegal, and might cost some of us everything we've got. Any man or woman who wants to leave has my respect and my blessing. No questions asked, no hard feelings. No one moved. Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with deep responsibility. These were people who understood that some fights had to be fought regardless of the odds. All right then, here's what we're facing. Federal marshals will arrive tomorrow night, probably with local backup from Morrison's deputies. They'll have legal papers that look official, weapons that shoot straight, and authority from Austin that trumps anything we can say. Miguel Gonzalez stepped forward, his old Navy Colt prominent on his hip. What's our advantage, Senor Mackenzie? We know this land better than they do, Thomas replied. We've got defensive positions they can't predict, and we've got something they don't, a righteous cause worth dying for. Billy emerged from the house carrying a detailed map Thomas had spent the afternoon drawing. The boy had been unusually quiet since Sheriff Hawkins' visit, but his eyes held the steady determination of someone who'd chosen his side and intended to hold it. Uncle Tom drew this from memory, Billy announced, spreading the map on the tailgate of Miguel's wagon. Shows every building, every fence line, every place where riders might take cover or find good shooting positions. Thomas pointed to various locations on the map as he spoke. The ranch house is our stronghold. Stone walls, thick timber, small windows positioned for defensive fire. Sister Catherine will set up her medical station in the root cellar, where she'll have protection from stray bullets and space to treat wounded. Sister Catherine looked up sharply. I should be fighting alongside the rest of you. You'll be fighting, Thomas assured her, but with instruments and bandages instead of rifles. These men have families depending on them going home alive. You're the only one here with medical training good enough to give them that chance. Carlos Herrera studied the map with the practiced eye of a man who'd fought Apaches in his younger days. What about escape routes if the position becomes untenable? 3 ways out, Thomas replied, tracing lines on the map. North through the creek bed to the canyon country, where horses can't follow easily. West across the open prairie to the railroad construction camps, where federal marshals won't want to cause trouble with railroad security. and south through this Mexican settlement, where witnesses might complicate any official story about what happened here. Maria Gonzalez had been studying the map over her husband's shoulder. How many marshals are we expecting? Sheriff Hawkins thinks 4, maybe 6, plus whatever local support Morrison can provide. Figure on 10 to 12 men total, well-armed and experienced. The odds were sobering but not impossible. Defensive positions, knowledge of terrain, and desperate motivation could balance longer odds than that. Billy had been unusually quiet during the planning session, but now he stepped forward with the kind of determined expression that reminded Thomas powerfully of his brother Robert. Uncle Tom, I want to help with more than just holding horses and running messages. Thomas looked at his nephew, seeing not the 12-year-old boy who'd nearly died of pneumonia 6 months ago, but a young man who'd been forced to grow up faster than anyone should have to. Billy could ride as well as most adults, shoot straight enough to put food on the table, and understood ranch operations better than hired hands twice his age. What did you have in mind, son? I know places on this ranch that aren't on any map, Billy said. Caves along the creek bank where I used to hide when I was little. Deer trails through the brush that a man could use to move without being seen. If things go bad, I could get Sister Catherine to safety without anyone knowing how. Thomas felt his chest tighten with pride and fear in equal measure. Billy, what we're talking about isn't a game. People are going to get hurt, maybe killed. You sure you're ready for that? Billy's green eyes held steady, older than his years, but clear with purpose. I'm ready, Uncle Tom. These are our people, and this is our land. Nobody's got the right to take it from us just because they've got badges and big talk. Sister Catherine reached out and touched Billy's shoulder gently. You're very brave, young man. Your parents would be proud of you. My parents are dead, Billy replied matter-of-factly. Uncle Tom and Sister Cat are my family now. I protect my family. The simple declaration hit Thomas harder than any bullet ever could. This boy had already lost everything once, and now he was prepared to risk his life to keep from losing it again. All right, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. Billy's our reconnaissance specialist and emergency evacuation coordinator. But you follow orders without question, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Yes, sir. Miguel cleared his throat, bringing attention back to practical matters. Senor Mackenzie, what about supplies? If we're going to hold this position for any length of time, we'll need food, water, ammunition, medical supplies. Sister Catherine spoke up. I've got enough medical supplies for basic trauma care. But if we're expecting a serious fight, I'll need more bandages, laudanum for pain relief, and clean water for surgery. Water's not a problem as long as they don't cut us off from the well, Thomas replied. Food we've got plenty of, plus ammunition for rifles and pistols. But if this turns into a siege lasting more than a day or two, we'll have problems. Then we make sure it doesn't last that long, said Carlos Herrera grimly. Either we convince them to leave or we make them leave. As the group dispersed to make final preparations, Thomas found himself standing alone with Sister Catherine on the porch where this had all started. The stars were coming out in the clear Texas sky, bright and cold and indifferent to human struggles. Thomas, Sister Catherine said quietly, I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm grateful for everything you've done. You've shown me what real courage looks like. Courage? Thomas almost laughed. Sister, I'm scared half to death. Got no idea if this plan will work or if we're all about to get ourselves killed for nothing. That's exactly what makes it courage, she replied. Doing what's right even when you're afraid, even when the odds are against you. That's what faith really means. Thomas looked at her in the starlight, seeing not just the nun who'd saved Billy's life or the woman who'd brought healing to his community, but someone who'd become as essential to him as breathing. The realization should have terrified him more than the approaching federal marshals, but instead it filled him with a calm certainty that surprised him. Sister Catherine, he said carefully, when this is over, assuming we're all still alive to worry about it, I'd like to talk to you about your future plans. She met his gaze directly, and Thomas saw something in her blue eyes that made his heart race like he was 20 years old again. I'd like that very much, Thomas. Whatever my future holds, I hope it includes the people who've become my family here. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of a ranch preparing for war. Tomorrow would bring federal marshals and legal papers, bullets and blood and consequences that would echo through the rest of their lives. But tonight on the porch of Iron Cross Ranch, a stubborn rancher and a determined nun found something worth fighting for, and counted that as victory enough to face whatever dawn might bring. The die had been cast, the sides chosen, and the battle lines drawn. In 12 hours, they would learn whether justice could triumph over legal authority, whether courage could overcome superior numbers, and whether love could prove stronger than the forces arrayed against it. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight was for preparation, for prayer, and for the quiet certainty that some things were worth any price required to protect them. Iron Cross Ranch, December 1916. The fire crackled in the stone hearth as Thomas Mackenzie paused in his telling, watching the flames dance across memories that had shaped 3 generations of his family. Jimmy sat transfixed on his wooden stool, the weight of the Mackenzie legacy settling on his young shoulders like a mantle he was only beginning to understand. "So Governor Hubbard arrested the federal marshals right there?" Jimmy asked, his voice carrying the wonder of youth discovering that justice sometimes did triumph over corruption. Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with satisfaction that time had not diminished. "Right there in our front yard, Billy's telegraph had reached the right people just in time. But that wasn't the end of the story, boy. That was barely the beginning." The old man reached for another piece of wood, feeding the fire that had warmed Iron Cross Ranch for 33 years. Outside, winter wind howled across the plains, but inside the solid walls Thomas had built with his own hands, warmth and safety reigned supreme. "What I haven't told you yet," Thomas continued, "is how your grandmother Catherine and I learned that some victories cost more than defeats, and some beginnings require endings that break your heart before they heal it." September 17th, 1883. The celebration at Iron Cross Ranch lasted exactly 4 hours before Thomas understood that exposing Morrison's conspiracy had solved one problem while creating a dozen others. Governor Hubbard's Texas Rangers had arrested the corrupt officials and fraudulent federal marshals, but the railroad interests behind Morrison's scheme weren't about to accept defeat gracefully. "Mr. Mackenzie," Governor Hubbard said, accepting a cup of Catherine's coffee on the ranch house porch, "I need you to understand what you've uncovered here. This conspiracy reaches into the War Department, the Interior Department, and at least 6 territorial governments from Texas to California." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching evening. "How deep does it go?" "Deep enough that some very powerful people are going to want you and Sister Catherine silenced permanently," the governor replied grimly. "Morrison was just the local face of an operation that's stolen maybe 500,000 acres of land across the Southwest." Sister Catherine emerged from the house where she'd been treating Marshall Crawford's shattered wrist with the same professional competence she brought to healing anyone in need. Her black habit was stained with blood, but her voice remained steady. "Governor Hubbard, are you suggesting that exposing this conspiracy has put us in greater danger than before?" "I'm saying that corrupt federal marshals were the least of your problems," Hubbard replied. "The men behind this operation have resources that make Judge Morrison look like a small-town amateur." Billy had been listening from the porch steps, his young face serious with the understanding that adult victories often came with adult consequences. "What kind of resources?" Sheriff Ben Hawkins answered with the grim knowledge of a lawman who'd seen how far corruption could reach. "The kind that can make people disappear, discredit witnesses, and arrange accidents for folks who know too much." Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "So what do you recommend, Governor?" Hubbard studied the faces around him, measuring courage against practicality with the experienced eye of a politician who'd survived territorial politics for 15 years. "I recommend you consider relocating somewhere these interests can't reach you. New Mexico territory, maybe Colorado. Somewhere you can start fresh without targets painted on your backs." "Leave Iron Cross Ranch?" Billy said, his voice carrying the shock of someone asked to abandon everything that gave life meaning. "This is our home." "Home doesn't mean much if you're dead," Father Santos observed quietly. The priest had remained at the ranch to provide moral support, but his presence carried weight beyond spiritual comfort. "The church can arrange sanctuary and missions throughout the Southwest if necessary." Thomas walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the rolling prairie that had been his world for 20 years. Every acre of Iron Cross Ranch represented sweat and sacrifice, dreams built from nothing and defended against every threat the frontier could devise. The thought of abandoning it felt like cutting out his own heart. How long before Morrison's backers make their move? Thomas asked. Days, maybe weeks, Governor Hubbard replied. Depends on how quickly they can organize a response. But make no mistake, they will respond. Too much money is at stake to let this slide. Sister Catherine joined Thomas at the porch railing, her presence warm and steady beside him. Thomas, maybe the governor is right. Maybe protecting Billy and the families who've helped us means finding somewhere safer to build our future. Run away, you mean, Thomas said bitterly. Strategic withdrawal, she corrected gently. There's no shame in protecting the people you love by removing them from danger. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking with the strategic mind that had kept him alive through Apache wars and range disputes. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd found his course regardless of consequences. I've been running from things my whole life, he said finally. Ran from my father's farm back in Tennessee. Ran from grief when Margaret died. Ran from responsibility until Billy needed a home. I'm done running. Billy stood up with sudden determination. Me too, this is Mackenzie land, and Mackenzies don't quit. Sister Catherine studied both of them with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who understood that some principles were worth dying for. Then we make our stand here, but we do it smart, with allies and preparation. Governor Hubbard shook his head sadly. Sister Catherine, I admire your courage, but courage won't stop a bullet fired by a professional assassin. Maybe not, she replied, but faith can move mountains, and we've already seen what's possible when people stand together for what's right. Over the next week, Iron Cross Ranch transformed from a working cattle operation into the headquarters of a resistance movement that stretched across 3 counties. Word of Morrison's downfall and the conspiracy's exposure spread through the Mexican communities like wildfire, bringing volunteers from farms and ranches that had been targeted by the corrupt land grab. Miguel Gonzalez arrived on the 3rd day with news that chilled Thomas to the bone. Senor Mackenzie, strangers have been asking questions about you and Sister Catherine in San Antonio. Professional men with expensive clothes and dead eyes. How many? Thomas asked. At least 6 that we know of, maybe more. They're offering gold for information about your habits, your defenses, your daily routines. Sister Catherine was treating a ranch hand's infected cut at the kitchen table, but Thomas noticed how her hands stilled at Miguel's report. What kind of information specifically? When you leave the ranch, where you go, how many men you keep for security, whether Sister Catherine travels alone for medical calls? Thomas felt rage build in his chest like pressure in a boiler. These weren't lawmen or even corrupt officials. They were professional killers hired to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The rules of engagement had changed completely. Miguel, how many families are willing to stand with us if this comes to a fight? 37 families have sent men, Miguel replied with pride. Over 100 rifles, plus women who can reload and 10 wounded. But Senor Mackenzie, these are farmers and ranchers, not soldiers. Then we'll have to teach them to be soldiers, Thomas said grimly. Billy, Saddle Sergeant, we're going to take a ride around our defenses. For the next 3 days, Iron Cross Ranch buzzed with activity that would have impressed a military quartermaster. Defensive positions were established at every approach to the ranch house, with overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions planned for strategic withdrawal. Sister Catherine organized medical stations throughout the property, training Mexican women in battlefield medicine and trauma care. Billy proved invaluable as a scout and communications coordinator, his knowledge of every trail and hiding spot on the ranch making him the perfect messenger between defensive positions. Thomas watched his nephew mature before his eyes, the boy's natural leadership abilities emerging under pressure that would have broken many adults. Uncle Tom, Billy said on the 4th evening as they checked perimeter defenses, I've been thinking about something. What if they don't come at us directly? What if they try to force us out by attacking the Mexican families who've helped us? Thomas felt a chill of recognition. It was exactly the kind of strategy professional killers would employ. Hit soft targets to demoralize defenders and create impossible choices between protecting different groups of innocent people. Smart thinking. What do you suggest? Billy pointed to his hand-drawn map of the county, marking Mexican settlements with careful precision. We set up rotating patrols to guard the most isolated families, and we prepare fallback positions where everyone can gather if things go bad. Where? Here, Billy said, indicating a box canyon about 5 miles north of Iron Cross Ranch. Natural fortress with water source and only one entrance. Could hold 200 people if necessary. Thomas studied his nephew's tactical thinking with growing respect. The boy was learning to think like a general, considering not just immediate threats, but long-term strategic options. Sister Catherine emerged from the house carrying a tray of coffee for the perimeter guards. But Thomas noticed how her eyes constantly scanned the horizon for signs of approaching danger. The woman who'd faced hanging with quiet dignity was learning to live with the constant threat of assassination. "Thomas," she said quietly, "Father Santos brought word from the Archbishop today. The church is willing to arrange protective sanctuary and missions throughout New Mexico and Colorado. We could leave tomorrow if we chose." "And abandon everyone who's helped us?" Thomas replied. "Miguel's family, Carlos Herrera, all the Mexican ranchers who've risked everything to support us? They could come too. The church has resources to help entire communities relocate if necessary." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over land that had been his life for 20 years. "Catherine, if we run now, what message does that send to men like Morrison's backers? That you can steal land and murder witnesses as long as you have enough money and political connections?" She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm despite the evening chill. "It sends the message that protecting innocent people is more important than proving points. But some points are worth proving," Billy said with the absolute certainty of youth. "If we don't stop these men here, they'll just keep doing this to other people in other places." Sister Catherine looked at Thomas and Billy with the clear understanding that they'd made their choice regardless of her concerns. "Then we stay and fight, but we do it with proper preparation and realistic understanding of the odds." That night, as defensive positions were manned and weapons checked for the 20th time, Thomas stood on his porch looking out at the vast Texas sky. Somewhere in the darkness, professional killers were probably planning their approach to Iron Cross Ranch, calculating how to eliminate witnesses to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. But Thomas Mackenzie had spent 30 years learning how to defend what mattered, and what mattered most was standing beside him in a black habit, discussing battlefield medicine with Mexican women who'd become soldiers overnight. The attack came 3 hours before dawn on September 23, 1883, launched by 12 professional gunmen who moved through the darkness like ghosts seeking vengeance. Thomas woke to the sound of rifle fire from the north perimeter, followed by Billy's voice calling urgent warnings from his observation post in the barn loft. "Riders coming from 3 directions," Billy shouted across the yard. "Count 12 men, moving fast and coordinated." Thomas was dressed and armed within 30 seconds, his Winchester loaded and ready as he took position behind the stone wall that surrounded the ranch house. Sister Catherine appeared beside him, carrying her medical bag and a Spencer rifle that she handled with surprising competence. "Medical station is ready in the root cellar," she reported calmly. "Maria Gonzalez and 3 other women are standing by for casualty treatment." The first volley of gunfire shattered the pre-dawn silence, bullets chewing chunks from the stone wall and sending splinters flying from the wooden porch supports. These weren't territorial marshals or corrupt officials. They were professional killers who shot with deadly accuracy and coordinated their assault with military precision. Miguel Gonzalez opened fire from the barn, his old Navy Colt booming like thunder across the yard. One of the attackers spun from his saddle, clutching a shattered shoulder, but the others pressed their assault without hesitation. "They're trying to surround us," Carlos Herrera called out from the corral position. 6 men coming up from the creek bed." Thomas sighted carefully through his Winchester scope, leading a rider who was trying to flank their position from the east. His shot took the man's center mass, dropping him from his horse with the finality of professional marksmanship. But for every attacker who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. These men had resources and planning that made Judge Morrison's corrupt officials look like amateurs. They moved with tactical precision that spoke of military training and combat experience. "Thomas!" Sister Catherine called out. "Wounded man coming in from the north position." Thomas saw Roberto Mendoza stumbling toward the house, blood streaming from a head wound that had him barely conscious. Sister Catherine vaulted over the stone wall with complete disregard for the bullet snapping around her, grabbing the wounded man and dragging him toward the medical station. "Cover her!" Thomas shouted to Miguel, who immediately laid down suppressing fire that kept the attackers' heads down long enough for Sister Catherine to reach safety. The battle raged for 20 minutes of intense gunfire before Thomas realized they were facing a problem that courage couldn't solve: superior numbers and professional tactics that were systematically eliminating their defensive positions. "Billy," Thomas called out, "time for Plan B." His nephew immediately understood, producing a mirror that he used to flash coded signals toward the box canyon where the rest of the Mexican families were waiting with horses and supplies for emergency evacuation. "What's Plan B?" Sister Catherine asked as she emerged from the root cellar, her hands bloody from treating Roberto's wounds. "We fall back to the canyon," Thomas replied grimly. "This position's becoming untenable." As if to emphasize his point, a bullet shattered the kitchen window, sending glass fragments across the room where Sister Catherine had been working moments before. "Covering fire!" Miguel shouted from the barn. "Everyone fall back to secondary positions." The withdrawal was executed with precision, born of desperate preparation. Thomas and Billy provided covering fire while the Mexican defenders moved in coordinated groups toward horses that had been positioned for exactly this contingency. Sister Catherine helped load wounded onto wagons with the efficiency of someone who'd organized battlefield evacuations before. Her black habit was stained with blood and dirt, but her voice remained calm as she directed the evacuation. "Thomas," she said as the last wagon pulled away toward the canyon, "what about Iron Cross Ranch? 20 years of your life." Thomas took one last look at the ranch house he'd built with his own hands, the corrals where he'd broken horses, and the pastures where he'd raised cattle. Bullets were already starting fires in the barn, and he knew that by morning nothing would remain but ashes and memories. "Home isn't a place," he said quietly. "It's the people you choose to protect." They rode hard toward the box canyon as Iron Cross Ranch burned behind them, pursued by professional killers who'd been hired to eliminate witnesses to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. But Thomas Mackenzie had learned something in 30 years of frontier life. Sometimes the greatest victory came not from holding ground, but from preserving what mattered most to fight another day. Box Canyon, September 24th, 1883. Dawn broke over the natural fortress that had become home to nearly 200 people overnight, refugees from a land grab that stretched across the southwest. Thomas stood on the canyon rim watching smoke rise from the direction of Iron Cross Ranch, feeling the loss of 20 years' work like a physical wound. Sister Catherine climbed up beside him, her black habit replaced by practical riding clothes borrowed from Maria Gonzalez. She carried coffee and the quiet strength that had sustained them through the darkest night of their lives. "Any regrets?" she asked, handing him the steaming cup. Thomas considered the question with the honesty their relationship deserved. Below them, Mexican families were organizing camp with the efficiency of people who'd faced displacement before. Children played between the wagons, while adults discussed security and supply distribution. "About leaving Iron Cross Ranch? No," Thomas said finally. "About everything we've started here? Not for a minute." Billy emerged from a reconnaissance mission to the canyon mouth, his young face serious with responsibility that would have impressed professional soldiers. "Uncle Tom, I've got news, good and bad." "Give me the bad first." "Those proportional gunmen burned everything. Ranch house, barn, corrals, even poisoned the well and scattered the cattle. Iron Cross Ranch is gone." Thomas felt something die inside his chest, but his voice remained steady. "And the good news?" Billy's face lit up with the fierce satisfaction of youth discovering that justice sometimes did triumph. "Governor Hubbard's here with 2 companies of Texas Rangers. Turns out those professional killers made a mistake when they used federal telegraph lines to coordinate their attack. That's interference with federal communications, which gave Hubbard authority to treat this as an act of war." Sister Catherine looked up sharply. "What happened to the gunmen?" 6 dead, 6 captured, including their leader," Billy reported with satisfaction. "Hubbard's got them talking about who hired them and how the conspiracy works. Turns out Morrison was just the local face of something that goes all the way to Washington." Thomas felt hope stir in his chest for the first time since the attack began. What about protection for the families here? That's the best part, Billy said with growing excitement. Hubbard's arranged for federal protection while Congress investigates the land grab conspiracy. Plus, he's offering to help us resettle wherever we want, with government assistance for rebuilding. Sister Catherine studied Thomas's face with the clear understanding that major decisions needed to be made. Thomas, where do you want to rebuild? Colorado Territory has good ranch land and fewer corrupt officials. Thomas looked out over the canyon where Mexican and Anglo families were working together with the cooperation born of shared struggle. Children were learning each other's languages, while adults discussed livestock and farming techniques that could benefit everyone. I've been thinking about that, Thomas said slowly. What if we didn't scatter? What if we built something new together? All of us. What do you mean? Sister Catherine asked. I mean, what if we pooled our resources and created a community where Mexican and Anglo families could work together? Where you could build your hospital and I could rebuild my ranch, but as part of something larger? Billy's eyes lit up with understanding. Like a town, but one we design ourselves with everything we've learned? Exactly like that, Thomas confirmed. Governor Hubbard's offering assistance for resettlement. What if we asked for help establishing a new community in Colorado Territory with legal protection against the kind of corruption we've been fighting? Sister Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities that went far beyond personal survival. The church would support such a venture. The Archbishop has been looking for opportunities to establish medical missions in developing communities. Miguel Gonzalez had been listening from nearby, and now he stepped forward with the dignity of a man who'd fought for his family's future. Senor Mackenzie, if you're serious about this proposal, I speak for 37 families who would join such a venture. Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the early days of building Iron Cross Ranch. The excitement of creating something new and meaningful from nothing but vision and determination. Then let's do it, he said with growing conviction. Let's build a town where people are judged by their character instead of their race or religion, where corruption can't take root because everyone has a stake in protecting what we've built together. Sister Catherine reached out and took his hand, her touch warm with promise and possibility. Thomas Mackenzie, are you proposing to build a utopia in the Colorado wilderness? I'm proposing to build a home, Thomas replied, for all of us, together. That evening, as plans began to take shape around cooking fires that lit the canyon like stars, Thomas found himself standing with Sister Catherine and Billy, looking toward a future that seemed brighter than anything he'd dared imagine. What will we call this new town? Billy asked. Thomas looked at the woman whose faith had moved mountains and the boy whose courage had exposed corruption in the highest levels of government. How about New Hope? Sister Catherine smiled, and Thomas saw their future written in her blue eyes like a promise of better days to come. New Hope sounds perfect. Iron Cross Ranch, December 1916. The fire had burned low while Thomas told his story, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the ranch house that had been rebuilt stronger and more beautiful than its predecessor. Jimmy Mackenzie sat transfixed, understanding for the first time how his family's legacy had been forged in courage and sacrifice. So you did build New Hope? Jimmy asked. Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with satisfaction that 3 decades had not diminished. Built it and watched it grow into something none of us could have imagined. Your grandmother Catherine established the finest hospital between Denver and Santa Fe. Miguel Gonzalez became mayor for 12 years running. Billy grew up to be a territorial legislator who helped write Colorado's statehood constitution. And Iron Cross Ranch? We rebuilt it bigger and better, with the blessing of everyone who'd fought to defend the dream it represented. Thomas gestured toward the window where moonlight illuminated pastures that now supported 3,000 head of cattle. But more importantly, we proved that people of different backgrounds could work together to create something stronger than what any of us could have built alone. Jimmy stood up from his wooden stool, feeling the weight of family history settling on his shoulders like a mantle he was finally ready to wear. Grandpa Tom, when I come back from the war, I want to help carry on what you and Grandma Catherine started. Thomas felt his chest tighten with pride and hope for a future that would be shaped by yet another generation of Mackenzies. Son, what we started was the idea that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. justice, family, the right of decent people to build lives without fear of corruption or persecution. And those things are still worth fighting for? More than ever, Thomas confirmed. The world's changing fast, but the need for people willing to stand up for what's right never goes away. Jimmy nodded with the seriousness of youth accepting adult responsibility. Then that's what I'll do, in France, and when I come home to New Hope. Thomas reached for the small wooden boss on the side table, removing Sister Catherine's silver cross and placing it in his great-nephew's hands. This belonged to your grandmother. She wore it through everything we faced together, and it reminded her that faith and courage often amounted to the same thing. Jimmy held the cross carefully, feeling the weight of 3 generations of Mackenzie determination. I'll bring it back safe. I know you will, son, and when you do, there'll be stories to tell your own children about how the Mackenzie name got its weight in a new century. Outside, the winter wind howled across the Colorado plains, but inside the solid walls that Thomas had built with his own hands, warmth and safety and the promise of tomorrow reigned supreme. The legacy was secure, the stories told, and the future stretched ahead like an open trail toward everything good and decent and worth fighting to preserve. In the distance, the lights of New Hope twinkled like stars fallen to earth, marking a community that had grown from desperate refugees into a thriving town of 5,000 souls. The hospital Sister Catherine had founded now trained doctors who served throughout the West, while the principles they'd fought to defend had become the foundation of Colorado statehood. Thomas Mackenzie settled back in his weathered leather chair, watching the flames dance in the fireplace he'd rebuilt 33 years ago, and counted himself the wealthiest man in 3 states. Not because of the cattle or the land or the investments that had made the Mackenzie name synonymous with prosperity, but because he'd learned that the greatest fortune came from building something that would outlast your own life. The boy who'd nearly died of pneumonia had grown into a man who helped write a state constitution. The woman who'd faced hanging for healing the sick had become the most respected doctor in Colorado territory. And the stubborn rancher who'd cut her down from a cottonwood tree had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory came not from taking lives, but from saving them. As Jimmy headed upstairs to pack for a war that would test his generation's courage, Thomas remained by the dying fire, grateful for everything that had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was for remembrance, for gratitude, and for the quiet certainty that some things were truly worth any price required to defend them. The Mackenzie legacy would endure, carried forward by young hands that had learned to value justice over profit and courage over comfort. And somewhere in the Colorado mountains, Sister Catherine's hospital continued its work of healing, while the town they'd built together stood as proof that hope and determination could triumph over any force arrayed against them. The story was told, the lessons passed down, and the future secure in the hands of those who understood that freedom and justice were not gifts to be received, but responsibilities to be earned anew by each generation willing to fight for what mattered most.